Her Honor, Janet Austin, our Lieutenant Governor, has embraced this role with humility and enthusiasm. Her basic belief in the goodness of people and her compassion for those in need, in particular women and children, is felt by all who meet her. As head of the YWCA, she initiated programs that focused on supporting the most vulnerable in our community. As Lieutenant Governor, she continues her mission of service by concentrating on themes that are really close to her heart: democracy, reconciliation, diversity and inclusion, and of course, women. A conversation with Her Honor, Janet Austin, BC's 30th Lieutenant Governor. Your Honor, thank you so much for having this conversation.
Oh, Carol, thanks so much for coming. It's always a pleasure, just an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
When you think back to the young woman you were, how would you describe her growing up?
Well, you know, I was very shy. I was quite bookish. I loved to read, and I still love to read. My father always saw me as being very artistic, like his mother. So I had ballet lessons and music lessons and all of that sort of thing, which I enjoyed very much. But I was, I'd say, primarily very shy and a little bit intellectual, you know, with sort of kind of crooked glasses, you know, looking back at pictures of myself. So yeah, that I think is probably the strongest characteristic.
The theme that's run through all of your various careers is your social conscience, your idea about always helping other people. Did that come from your parents?
You know, I think it did, and I didn't realize it as a young person how much they influenced me. But the older I get, the more I see myself turning into my parents. And I think as a younger person, I wouldn't have liked that particularly, but I actually am quite proud of it now.
From the beginning, you were interested in public service.
You know, Carol, I've always been motivated by public service. I've had a lot of opportunities. I'm a very fortunate person in that I've had work that suits my skills, but has been socially meaningful and intellectually stimulating. And I've had some interesting opportunities that would have taken me into perhaps more of a private sector world, but I've always opted to find some way to be a public servant. And that's either through my professional work or through my volunteer work, which has been really, really meaningful to me.
So how are we so lucky that you ended up in BC?
Well, it's probably a kind of common story. It was a relationship. I had been in a long-term relationship with a very nice man, and we'd lived together for some time. And he was a planner, architect, but decided to go to law school. And after he completed law school, he had an opportunity out here. And so I came with him. So the relationship didn't last, which was a good thing, but BC did. And BC, I've lived here longer than I lived in Alberta, and I just love BC. It's just a wonderful province, and I feel so privileged to have had most of my life here. Vancouver is such a dynamic city. I love the diversity of it, the dynamism of the culture. So it was kind of a natural place for me.
And you had a wonderful job with BC Housing.
I had a job with BC Housing. I had a lot of interesting jobs, actually. But yes, I really enjoyed working with BC Housing. I had a lot of opportunity there. I learned a tremendous amount. So a part of that role was I was responsible for the property acquisition, design, and construction of the social housing projects. And it always it interested me to be able to understand more about the life circumstances of people and how they could be supported, really, to thrive.
And what tremendous learning that would be for you, who then became CEO of the
Right.
YWCA.
Yeah, it was a great experience, actually. I obviously took my knowledge from the housing sector and was able to apply that in my work at the Y. We built quite a bit of housing when I was there. And I had some excellent relationships with BC Housing that, I've continued to nurture to this day. And that was really, I think, helpful in terms of having a level of confidence in working at the municipal level. I've worked in regional planning in the past before and public consultation, and as you said, in communications. And so really my work at the Y, it was like a confluence of all of the previous experiences that I'd had. And I felt like I was able to draw on knowledge and skills that I'd acquired in different roles and bring them to the Y.
And you put your own stamp on it, especially, I think, with your initiatives concerning women and children. Was that something that you set out to do, or it just evolved?
It was always important to me, and I think I couldn't possibly take credit for that being a key focus for the YWCA because it's historic. I mean, the organization was initially founded in the 1850s in Britain, and the primary focus was to support women. And what's interesting is that so many of the issues that were dealt with at that time, persist to this day. So the need for housing, the need for employment, the concerns around the care of children, women who are raising children on their own. All of these things really are historic and part of the YWCA history and culture. And I believe, was able to build on that. And I really did focus, I think, in my role there on helping to bring those issues to public awareness, to greater prominence in public awareness. The other thing I feel very proud of in terms of my work with the Y was helping people to see it and understand it as a very successful social enterprise, a very disciplined organization that was larger, frankly, and more profitable than many of the businesses that comprise the network of business operations in Greater Vancouver. So people will often think about the nonprofit culture, and there's often a message about you need to learn the discipline of the private sector. And I always felt that there are well-run nonprofit organizations and poorly run ones, just as there are well-run businesses and poorly run businesses.
So are you a risk taker?
I'm a calculated risk taker. I'm someone who is excited and motivated by making something happen, by getting something done. So I'm someone who's more on the front end with the idea, and being in an environment where you have a wonderful team, a competent team that can actually support you is kind of perfect for me, I get bored when things are very routine, and, once you have an initiative in place and it's being operationalized, my natural tendency is to move on to something else. And the YWCA really enabled me to do that in a way that was enormously satisfying.
And then you got a call.
Yeah, I did.
Were you surprised
Completely.
when you were approached about being Lieutenant Governor?
Completely. It was the last thing in the world on my mind. It never would have occurred to me. And the Prime Minister's office had booked me for a telephone call, and I thought, oh, well, perhaps the Prime Minister's coming to town, or maybe they want some intelligence on what's going on in housing or something like that. I thought nothing of it. And the people came on the phone. I hadn't met them or spoken with them before. And the first thing, I believe the woman's name was Hillary, said, well, the reason we're calling you is we wanted your permission to do a security clearance check for a possible appointment as Lieutenant Governor. That was the first I'd heard of it.
What was your response?
Well, my response was, really? Where did that come from? Because I had no idea. And she said, well, people have been talking about you. And I thought, well, I had no idea. And so I didn't immediately say yes. I said it would obviously be an honor to serve the country in that way, but I need to understand a little bit more about the role. I knew what the job was, but I wanted to understand primarily what the constraints were, because I've been an advocate and I've worked on issues and I've enjoyed that tremendously. And I've always worked in what I would characterize as a nonpartisan or a cross-partisan way, which is to focus on an issue that I think is fundamental, but to try to bring people who have very different views together to work on something that is of foundational importance. And I've always worked that way. I've never been, I love politics, I love watching politics, but I've never been a member of a particular political party. And so I needed to understand how constrained I would be in bringing profile to ideas and issues that are important.
I'm curious what the response was.
Well, I spoke to people at the Privy Council office. Obviously, you have to maintain a nonpartisan stance, which is not a problem for me. But where we ended up was it's acceptable to use the evidence base to bring profile to ideas. But I do refrain from commenting publicly on policies that are the subject of current political debate discussion. I got back to them and I said, yes, that I would be honored to serve should I be accepted. So they did all that, and then I thought, well, they have many people they'll be looking at, and I could think of all kinds of people who would be much better than me, like you, for example. and so I didn't really expect that I would actually be selected. So I actually was quite surprised when the Prime Minister did call and ask if I would take the role. So it was great.
Why do you think it's important, this relationship with Canada, British Columbia, and the monarchy?
I do feel very strongly that our constitutional monarchy is a stabilizing characteristic in our society. It connects us to a tradition of parliamentary democracy, respect for the rule of law. It connects us to a network of Commonwealth countries that are unified by some basic values that they share. Our human rights are protected. So there are many things that come from that tradition. I think also that the separation of state and government is a very healthy thing because it's a check on the power of the First Minister. And when we look around the world today, we see the fragility of democracy, and we see that even the most seemingly stable of societies can be subject to authoritarian capture. And the fact that we have this separation of state and government, the fact that the Premier needs to come to me to request to hold an election, this was, of course, an issue during the pandemic, is a check on that power. So the reserve powers of the Crown are very seldom used, but they do exist and they are real.
Is there anything about this job that surprised you?
Not really. I had a pretty good understanding of what was involved. So no, I have to honestly say, I didn't. And I had prepared myself, I think, around those questions of what's appropriate for me to engage in and discuss and what's not. So I was well prepared in that respect. I'm a hard worker, and so I knew that I would embrace the role fully and want to maximize the opportunities that come with that role. But what I really love is working on issues. And I love having a platform where I can, when the Lieutenant Governor calls, people tend to pay attention. That's been a wonderful thing, to be able to bring people in, to share the resources of Government House with them, but to be able to create the conditions for some really thoughtful conversations about what's important in our society and what's important about our future and where we go.
I think that may be one of the sort of most important characteristics of your time in this office is you as a convener, because you've done it on issues that are really touching your heart. For instance, I know that you've done a lot of work on women especially, but human trafficking?
It is a very complex, it's a complex topic, it's a complex issue, and there are philosophical and legal underpinnings of the whole issue, which often divide people, that can be an excuse for not attempting to address it. And I just think that's wrong. I think the time has come when we need to confront some of these challenges in our society that most people are unaware of, and to recognize that this is a problem that doesn't just exist somewhere far away. It exists in Canada as well. Women are trafficked across major transportation corridors. Vulnerable women are primarily Indigenous women and girls, but also women in rural Quebec who don't speak English and are particularly vulnerable because of that when they're in a Western context.
And so how do you see your role? You brought people together and you had this in-depth conversation, exchange of ideas. Are there next steps for you, or do you hand it off?
I don't plan to play a major role. I don't plan to. I think I'm primarily a convener. I will continue to support the work, but we don't have the capacity at Government House. And it wouldn't be appropriate for me to take something like that on in a big way. So this is what I have done, is I've attempted to work with partners, with universities, with other organizations around issues that I think require some profile, should come to greater public attention, and work with them.
One of the issues you've brought to my attention recently is that of concussions, brain injuries, but you've broadened this. We think of sports players, right? They get a concussion on the ice, but you talk about the way you're looking at it.
Yeah, so again, this is something that has come to my attention fairly recently. And despite all the work that I've done, working over many years, working with women who are vulnerable, who've experienced abuse, I was quite unaware of the extent to which domestic violence leads to brain injury. So this came to my attention through a local organization, the Cridge Society for the Family locally, that has expertise in brain injury and also in domestic violence. They've been part of some studies, and they gave me a statistic which is absolutely shocking and really captured me. And that is, you referenced the fact that we're having a public conversation right now about concussion in sport, and that's a very positive thing. We need to understand it. It's primarily about men, and that's fine, that's good. But for every one brain injury that comes from an NHL or an NFL incident, there are 7,000 similar injuries from domestic violence, and that is completely below the radar.
Where does that number 7,000 come from? Is this
It's
people,
research,
and is it reporting to the ERs? Is that where they see it?
That's right. So these would be medically documented cases. I think it's probably just scratching the surface, because obviously there's so many instances that are not reported. This is a huge challenge as well, because many women who have this experience, the brain injury can be permanent and often life-changing. So there are physical, there are emotional implications, but there can also be permanent brain damage, things like memory loss, ongoing headaches that impair a woman's ability to work, or a person's ability to work or function. And it needs to be better understood.
So in all the work you've done on issues like this, whether it's human trafficking of young girls or whether it's domestic abuse, women in poverty, does it get inside you? Like, how do you cope with that?
Well, it breaks my heart, But, I'm a pretty resilient person. I would say as well that I am someone who I've been on the organizing side, the leadership side. I'm not somebody who has, on a day-to-day basis, dealt with this directly in a personal way, like provided direct care to people. And I think that is much, much more challenging.
So with your interests so broadly into the social services areas, Why aren't you in politics?
You know, Carol, I sometimes feel guilty because I've had pressure, actually from various parties, to be honest. And I had pressure, I had some fairly heavy pressure to run for mayor. But I don't think I don't have a thick enough skin, truly. And also, when I think about why I've been successful, I think I've been successful because I'm good with people, and I'm good at bringing people together, you know. Good at sort of bridging that gap in views and finding common ground. And that's something I feel very proud of. Like, how do we find those places of compromise in between the extremes of public opinion? That's my whole thing. But as a politician, you inevitably are moved into a role which is more oppositional. And I'm not that good at that. So I know that about myself. I also thought, in many ways, you know, I have more influence at doing what I'm doing than I might have as a backbencher, you know.
And you'd never be a backbencher.
Probably. I'm sure everybody has to, you know, has to learn and to move on. And I would have difficulty. I'd have difficulty towing the party line, to be honest, because I'm, you know, I think I'm an independent thinking person, and I'm not a partisan. I have huge respect. I have many, many political friends. You know, I have my red meat conservative friends, and I have my communist friends, and I respect them all.
Are you telling me this is a no?
The time has passed. Carol, I'm 67, and also we need younger people in politics. We really do. But there is a part of me that feels a bit guilty that I never did that.
So when you look at yourself in the situation you are, the power that you've been able to use towards social services, what happened to that shy little girl?
Well, I still, you know, people laugh when I say this, but I am a little bit of an introvert, you know. I know, see, people laugh, and I enjoy people, I really do, but I need my time alone, you know. And so I'm a learned extrovert. I've always had jobs that are public facing, and for the most part I've enjoyed them, but I do need to have those breaks. And so sometimes, you know, I'll be at an event and there's an expectation that you're going to animate the table and create conversation and make everybody comfortable. And sometimes I just have to get up, leave the room, go to the bathroom, even though I don't need to, just because I need a few minutes on my own. So that's an introverted characteristic, and it is a part of me. So that girl is still there. I think that girl was always curious and had opinions and liked to discuss and perhaps to argue, but she's still there.
Contributing as you always have. Thank you,
Carol, thank
Your
you.
Honor.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Her Honor, Janet Austin, a BC legend.